everybody. Welcome to another edition of Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and I'll be hanging out with you today as we kind of get on into our series on ecology. Topic for the day is going to be ecosystem disturbance and watershed studies. So like always, let me get you some objectives and we will get started for the day. By the end of this video, I need you to know or be able to do the following things. First up is to explain the practice of watershed studies. Second, compare and contrast ecosystem resistance and ecosystem resilience. And finally, describe the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So today's video is all about disturbance. In environmental science, when we talk about disturbance, we are talking about anything that alters the flow of energy or matter in an ecosystem. Now, this could be something as small as somebody building a house, or it could be something as large and devastating as a forest fire. So anything that is going to mess with the cycles that go on within an ecosystem is going to be considered to be a disturbance. And do recognize, like I just said, disturbances can be very small or they can be very large. They can do a tiny bit of damage or they can do a huge bit of damage. When ecosystem scientists or ecologists are studying disturbance, they look at something called a watershed and they do a watershed study. So first I need to tell you about what a watershed is. A watershed is all of the land in a particular area that drains to a single area. Now that single area could be a stream, it could be a river, it could be a lake, it could be a wetland, but right here we have got a illustration. This illustration shows the Cohansey watershed, and basically what you can kind of see here is this whole area right here that is colored lays in a valley. So you would have essentially mountains all the way around this thing, or at least an area of higher elevation. And as it rains and snows, all of the water that falls on the mountains ends up running into this watershed. So you can see that there are many different sizes of streams and creeks. So any rain that fell in this area would run into one of these small little tributaries, travel down the tributary, and then into the main river. And this river would be the drainage for the watershed, which looks like it lands out into the Delaware Bay. So that would be an example of a watershed. In a second, I'll talk to you about why ecologists like them a lot, but for now, just recognize that's what a watershed is. Now, as far as watershed studies go, what environmental scientists will do is they will study how nutrients cycle within the ecosystem of a watershed. And a watershed is a nice place to do that because you've just got one outlet for that whole valley. So everything that goes on in that valley is eventually going to run down into the main stream or river, and scientists can study what is coming out in the water of that river. You know, what is the oxygen content, what is the carbon dioxide content, what is the nitrate or the phosphorus levels in that creek, and so they can watch over time how the cycling of nutrients within that watershed changes. One very well-known watershed study is at Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire, and this area has been a watershed study for, I don't know, I guess since the 1960s, so it's been worked on for quite a while. And on the right you can see one of their very famous experiments that they did. The scientists working in this area wanted to study what happens when you deforest an area and then prevent plants from going back. So in part of the valley in the watershed that they were working on, they actually deforested a huge patch of land, which you can see right there, and they studied what happened to the levels of nutrients in the Hubbard Brook over time. They found that the area that had been disturbed and not allowed to have plants grow back had significantly raised levels of nitrates that were ending up in the water. So as the rain would fall, all the nitrates that were in the soil would end up washing away down into the brook and out of the ecosystem. So scientists were able to look at this and say, oh wow, if there are plants in an area, then those plants pull nitrates and other nutrients up from the soil and they keep those nutrients within the ecosystem. But if the plants aren't available, then the nutrients wash right out. So this is a really interesting example of the environment remaining healthy, and that is what keeps the nutrients there for the plants to keep growing. So it's kind of like by having plants in the area, more plants are able to grow in the area because the nutrients stay there. So recognize Hubbard Brook, very well-known watershed study. Also, when we talk about ecosystems, we have to talk about the difference between resistance and resilience. Now, when a disturbance comes along, if an ecosystem is resistant, there will be no change in the ecosystem productivity. Remember, we talked about ecosystem productivity as being the amount of carbon dioxide that is taken in and carbohydrates that are made by the plants in the area. If, let's say, a fire goes through, as is the example here on the right, it looks like that fire burnt out a bunch of the trees, but immediately a bunch of plants sprung back up. So rather than the trees being the productive part of the ecosystem, the plants on the forest floor became the productive part of the ecosystem. So the ecosystem might be producing the same amount, it might have the same productivity, it's just doing it through a different set of plants. So this would be an example of a resistant ecosystem. Now, in contrast, you have got a resilient ecosystem. If you're talking about resilience, you're talking about how long it takes an ecosystem to bounce back after a disturbance. So let's say that there has been a giant disturbance. Some ecosystems, like maybe, I don't know, a desert, could take years and years and years to rebound from that disturbance. It is not very resilient. It does not come back very quickly. But something like a grassland could burn over the summer and then bounce back the following year. So that would be an example of a resilient ecosystem. So resistant is whether or not the productivity changes. Resilience is how quickly it comes back after something has caused some damage. Now, the resilience of an ecosystem, like I said, can differ. And I want to give you two quick examples. One example would be carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have risen over the last 150 years, scientists have found that plants on the land and in the ocean have taken up increasingly more carbon dioxide. So it's kind of like more carbon dioxide that's in the air, the more carbon dioxide the plants take in. So that would be an example of resilient ecosystems. They bounce back very quickly and they just start taking in more carbon dioxide. Now, on the other side of the things, you've got a drought situation. On the right there, you got a picture of soil that has been cracked by drought. The thing that happens in a drought is as that soil dries up, it becomes hard and compacted, such that when it rains, the water can't actually soak into the soil. So it just runs off and actually causes flooding. So that would be an example of an ecosystem that is not that resilient. Once it gets bad, it actually keeps getting worse as that soil dries out. Now I want to finish up with the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This talks about the amount of biodiversity that is in a particular area. Now, scientists have hypothesized and shown experimentally that the amount of disturbance that a ecosystem receives determines the biodiversity in many ways of that ecosystem. So an ecosystem that has very low levels of disturbance would be right here, infrequent. It's an ecosystem that is not frequently disturbed. Biodiversity is going to be pretty low because in an ecosystem like this, there is so much competition that only the best competitors are able to survive. So rather than having an area where you've got tons of different plants, you've only got a couple weeds that win because they can basically outcompete everything else. Same can be said for animals. Over on the other end of the spectrum, you've got ecosystems that undergo a lot of disturbance. There are very frequent fires or hurricanes or tornadoes or a lot of human disturbance. Whatever the case, these are areas that are disturbed very frequently. And in areas like that, the plants and animals are not able to bounce back and reproduce quickly enough before the next disturbance comes along. So biodiversity will be low in that situation too. So scientists have said that ecosystems that have the highest biodiversity have an intermediate level of disturbance. There is enough disturbance to keep single species from outcompeting everybody else, but there's not enough that the animals and the plants cannot reproduce. So recognize that with regard to disturbance, somewhere in the middle produces the best biodiversity. And with that, I think we're done for the day. So thank you for joining us in this discussion of disturbance. This has been the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite. Hopefully we'll see you again.